all of you once more. Last week, we began by considering the canon of the Old Testament. Let me just grab a bunch of these and send them along. So I thought what we could do this evening to start off is review quickly what we had gone over last time. There should be some at the end, although I didn't expect quite so many tonight, so we may be a little shy. Are there extra copies? There we go. Yeah.
Are we going to need any more before you start? We'll make them.
Looks like we're going to make it. Uh-oh.
Any more copies? Oh.
What you have is an outline of the Old Testament. And as I mentioned to you last week, there are three major divisions in the Old Testament. Those are designated on the page by the capitalized bold titles. The first major division is the historical books. That section, in fact, comprises the bulk of the Old Testament. If you'll notice, the whole first column on the left is the historical books. So that certainly is the largest of the three major divisions of the Old Testament. The second major division is called wisdom literature. We can discuss in a couple of weeks what we mean by that term, but I'll point out to you that there are 7 books in that second section. It's significantly shorter than the first section. And then lastly you have the prophetic books. And here you find the people you would expect, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so on. God bless you. The wisdom literature section is short enough that no one subdivides it. There's only 7 books there. That's simple enough. The prophetic books, however, we subdivide into 2 sections, the major prophets and the minor prophets. Use of those terms primarily have to do with the length of the books. That's how the terms originated. If it was a big fat prophet's book, it's a major prophet. It's a little skinny prophet's book, it's a minor prophet. In fact, there are exactly 12 minor prophets, you'll notice. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. 12, of course, being a significant number because there were 12 tribes of Israel at the time at which this collection was made. But also, I mentioned to you last time that a typical scroll was approximately 30 feet in length. These 12 minor prophets all fit perfectly on your average scroll back then. So that may have something to do also with how we wound up with 12 rather than some other number. Of the major prophets, you'll find 6 books. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Baruch, Ezekiel, Daniel. However, there are only 4 major prophets, and those are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. What about these other 2 books, Lamentations and Baruch? Well, it turns out that those are fairly short books, and they have been put where they presently are in the Bible because they are appendixes to the book of Jeremiah. The book of Lamentations is 5 chapters long. It's a collection of 5 psalms. Each of them are laments for the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred at the time that Jeremiah was alive, and the coming destruction of Jerusalem was the main topic that Jeremiah had prophesied about. So these 5 psalms, although not written by Jeremiah, written shortly after him, came to be appended to the book of Jeremiah because, after all, they were about the same subject that Jeremiah had prophesied about. And the other appendix, Baruch, is explicable from a comment I made last time. Jeremiah had a sidekick who stood at his elbow writing down everything he wrote. That fellow's name was Baruch. So the book of Baruch purports to have been written by the secretary who traveled around with Jeremiah. It is not written by Jeremiah, but has Baruch as the name of his author. This brings us to the most difficult aspect of the outline of the Old Testament, and that is all of those subdivisions in the historical books. There are so many historical books that we don't just leave it undivided, or we don't just split it in half like the prophets. We have 5 subdivisions within the historical books of the Old Testament. Those subdivisions are the Pentateuch. We mentioned last time, penta means 5. Tukos is Greek for scroll. So, the 5 scrolls. This was a common phrase that was used to describe the first 5 books of the Bible by Jews who did not live in Palestine, but who lived out among the Greeks, and therefore used Greek to refer to them. They called them the Pentateuch. Jews, of course, don't call them the Pentateuch. What do they call them? The Torah, which is ordinarily translated law, but in Hebrew actually has a broader meaning of teaching or instruction. Nevertheless, law is probably an appropriate translation into English because Judaism's principal interest in the first 5 books is not so much the stories, but the legal material, all the laws that can be found there. Now that's the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And those first 5 books give us a history of the Jewish people. But that history goes all the way back to creation, as we know. First couple chapters of Genesis, you get the creation account. Adam and Eve in the garden. Then you get the story of Noah and the flood. You get Cain and Abel, Tower of Babel, all of these early stories prior to the ultimate ancestor of the Jewish people. And that ultimate ancestor is Abraham. Abraham shows up in chapter 12 of Genesis, and he and the other patriarchs, Isaac, Jacob, Jacob's sons, have their stories told in the remainder of the book of Genesis. Then you have Exodus, where Moses shows up. And, of course, the Exodus is the exiting from Egypt and the wilderness wanderings up to the Holy Land. And, in fact, the last 4 books of the Pentateuch are all concerned with Moses and the life of the Israelites under his hegemony. So whereas the book of Genesis goes from creation down to about 1250 or so when Moses was alive, the other 4 books cover only about 20 or 30 years, which is the period during which Moses was in charge of the Israelites. Consequently, the very last event that we read of at the absolute end of the Pentateuch, 34th chapter of Deuteronomy, is the death of Moses. Now, these stories of Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Moses, etc., were well known and probably written down prior to the 500s BC. But nobody had ever bothered to continue the history beyond Moses. And Moses probably died in like 1220 or so BC, way back there. What about the judges? What about the kings? David, Solomon. What about the prophets that showed up, Elijah, and so on? Well, somebody, probably in about 550 BC, decided to write a continuation of the ancient history of the Jewish people. So, where the Pentateuch ended, right there in chapter 34 of Deuteronomy with the death of Moses, this new author, writing in about 550, decides to bring the history up to date. And consequently, the second section there, which is called the Deuteronomistic history, is written by one guy. We don't know who he was, but he lived around the middle of the 500s BC, and he brought the history up to date from the death of Moses around the 1200s down to his own time around the middle of the 500s. So, you get the book of Joshua, which tells us what happened under Moses' successor. We get the book of Judges, which tells us about those leaders of ancient Israel who lived between Joshua and the beginning of the monarchy. Then you get the Kings. The books of Samuel is where you'll find the stories about the first two kings, Saul and David. And then you get all the stories about all the later kings in Israel. Solomon, Rehoboam, Jeroboam, etc. And those can be found in 1st and 2nd Kings. So whoever this fellow was, we owe him a great debt of gratitude because thanks to him we know what happened in the Israelite nation from the 1200s to the 500s. He wrote 4 scrolls. The 4 scrolls were, he intended it to be a 4-volume history. The 4 scrolls were Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And sure enough, if you write in Hebrew and you keep your print fairly small, you can cram all of 1st and Samuel on one scroll. And you can cram all of 1st and Kings on one scroll. If you write in Hebrew. But one of the characteristics of Hebrew is that it doesn't use vowels when you write it. Obviously, you use vowels when you speak it. But when you write it, you don't use the vowels. It's kind of like this is a word in Hebrew, dabar, but it's only 3 letters because we only use the consonants. Hebrew goes from right to left instead of left to right. So you've got D, B, R. And you have to know that it's dabar rather than dohor, or duhur, or some other consonants, or vowels involved there. This sometimes creates problems in our knowledge of exactly what the Hebrew text means. What does that say? Nowhere, right? No, it says now here. Sometimes you get that problem when you're trying to read the Hebrew text. Exactly what vowels are we supposed to supply? So, without vowels, you can get all the consonants of the Hebrew version of 1st and 2nd Samuel on one scroll. You cannot if you write it in Greek, because Greek includes the vowels. So Greek, it winds up being much longer, and so when the Jews translated the Bible from Hebrew to Greek, what was the name of that? Septuagint, right? 200 BC we were talking about. When they translated it into the Septuagint, they had to split those books into two. And that's why we wound up with 1st and 2nd Samuel, and that's why we wound up with 1st and 2nd Kings. In the Hebrew, there's only 4 volumes. In the Greek and the English, we wind up with 6. I know what you're thinking right now. There's a 7th book there, right? Ruth. Ruth is, in fact, included in the Deuteronomistic history. You're quite right. But Ruth was not originally part of that history. It's not part of what the anonymous historian in the 500s wrote when he brought the history up to date from Moses to his own time. What happened was, later on, probably around the 300s, about 3 centuries before Jesus, somebody, again, we don't know who, most of this ancient Jewish literature is anonymous, somebody wrote a short story. And they wrote a short story about David's grandmother. Well, David was the second king. If you go a couple of generations prior to David, you're back in the time of the Judges, right? So here was a short story whose temporal setting was the time of the Judges. Whoever made this decision took Ruth, which had become recognized as having been inspired, wondered where to stick it in the Old Testament, and decided, hey, I'll put it right after Judges. Because after all, it is a story about the time of the Judges. So Ruth gets inserted here, kind of like Lamentations and Baruch are appendices to Jeremiah. Ruth is an appendix to the book of Judges. But it wasn't originally part of the Deuteronomistic history. Well, time passes. You get down to around 400 BC, and somebody, again, we don't know who he was, we call him the chronicler, since we call his books 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Somebody around 400 decided, once again, to bring the history of the Jews up to date. Just like the Deuteronomistic historian has done. However, whereas the Deuteronomistic historian simply started where the previous history ended, at the Moses, and brought it up to his own time, this guy was much more ambitious. He decided that he was going to rewrite the whole of ancient Israelite history. So, his 4-volume work, the 4 volumes being 1st Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, starts with Adam. Right there where the Pentateuch started. And it goes to the death of Moses, and then from the death of Moses it continues on to 550 or so. And there you've got the first 2 volumes. The 1st Chronicles basically summarizes material we've already got in the Pentateuch. Although with a little different slant, because this is a guy writing in the 400s, and therefore with a little different cultural understanding of things. And the 2nd volume, 2nd Chronicles, is roughly a summary of the Deuteronomistic history. It takes us from Joshua through 550 or so. So, although 1st and 2nd Chronicles are important books, I mean, after all, they were inspired by God, nevertheless, they do largely repeat things that we already knew from the first 2 subdivisions of the historical books. Consequently, what's of special interest to us are the last 2 volumes, Ezra and Nehemiah, because that gives us information from 550 to 400, which neither of the previous 2 histories gave us, because they were written prior to this time. So Ezra and Nehemiah give us information we would not know about the history of the Jewish people had the chronicler not sat down and written his 4-volume history of the Jewish people around 400 BC. Well, those are the 3 big histories that you find in the historical book section of the Old Testament. What remains is 2 smaller collections, one of which is called 3 Short Stories, and one of which is called Maccabean History. But these are not continuous happen to have been inserted here because it seemed like a reasonable place to put them. They are, after all, past tense. They are narratives, like the other historical books. And they do deal with historical figures. They're like historical novels. You know, if you read somebody's novel about Queen Elizabeth's court or something, it's not really history, but it still has historical figures in it. So these three stories got shoved into the historical section of the Old Testament for want of a better place to put them. So you get these three stories, Tobit, Judith, and Esther. And then the last two books in the historical section of the Old Testament are given the title Maccabean History, which would lead you to believe that these two volumes, First Maccabees and Second Maccabees, are together a continuous history, just like the 4 volumes of the Chronicler's history or the 6 volumes of the Deuteronomistic history. But that's not true. Somebody, we don't know who, wrote First Maccabees around 165 concerning what was going on in his day, and then somebody else, 125 or so, wrote a volume about what was going on during the period of the Maccabees. So it's 2 different authors, unrelated to each other. And the second probably didn't know that the first had been written. So it's not a continuous 2-volume history comparable to the earlier ones. Nevertheless, these are both very interesting books because they tell us what was going on with the Jews in the 100s AD. That's the period of the Maccabees. Later this evening, if we get to it, next time we meet, if not, we're going to survey the history of ancient Israel, look at the major events, talk about the major figures in it, because we'll want that kind of a chronological framework for the remainder of our series, which will be looking at the literature in relation to those events. So when we do that, I'll explain what happened during the period of the Maccabees and that sort of thing. But we'll hold off on that for now. So there you have it, the outline of the Old Testament. 3 major divisions: historical books, wisdom literature, prophetic books. 5 subdivisions under the historical books: Pentateuch, Deuteronomistic history, Chronicler's history, 3 short stories, Maccabean history, and 2 subdivisions under prophetic books: major prophets and minor prophets. So, how many books are on this page? You already counted, huh? How many? 46, I think, right? You're thinking of Eastern Orthodox, I'll bet. Oh, really? Oh, thank you for mentioning that. I didn't have a copy in front of me, but that's a good point. There's a couple of books here that used to have names that we no longer use for them. One of those books was called Ecclesiastes, and the other is called Ecclesiasticus. But because those 2 names are so close to each other, it caused a lot of confusion. You know, if you're reading an article about the Bible, and you come across some quotation, and then after the quotation, you get something like that, chapter 3, verse 14. What is this, Ecclesiastes or Ecclesiasticus? You got to go look it up to find out where that quote is. So, to eliminate this ambiguity, most scholars nowadays no longer use the names Ecclesiastes or Ecclesiasticus. More and more, it's becoming common to call the first book Kohelet. That is its name in Hebrew. That's what Jews have always called it. Besides, that's what the author calls himself. He calls himself Kohelet. So we'll go with that name. Similarly, the second book says that it is written by Ben Sirach in Hebrew, Sirach in Greek. So we go with that name also to eliminate this ambiguity. Good point. But if we cut those 2, then we're down to 46. So which canon am I using here? Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or Protestant? Roman Catholic. Wonder why. If I did Eastern Orthodox, I'd have to add 2 more remember what those names of those books are? Sorry? Good. Third Maccabees, or Three Maccabees would be written. And the other one was tougher, First Esdras, Esdras. Now, Third Maccabees in a Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox Bible will show up after First and Second Maccabees. That's the last book in the historical section. First Esdras, I'm not sure where in the sequence of books Eastern Orthodox put that book. I should look that up so I know next time, but I don't recall right off. Anyway, they do have these two extra books. I know that I listed them on the board last time, but it would be good to put them on this sheet. And I didn't mark them because I wanted you to do it yourselves. So if you got a pen or something, you may want to note which are the 7 books that are found in Catholic Bibles, not found in Protestant Bibles. Which is the first one? Tobit. Good. And it's immediately followed by the second one. Consequently, the first 2 of those 3 short stories are not found in Protestant Bibles. Tobit and Judith. They do have Esther. That's 1 and 2. What are the next 2? First and Second Maccabees. Put an asterisk beside it, or however you want to mark those, as being part of the Catholic canon, but not part of the Protestant canon. That's it for the historical books, but that's 4 out of 6 already. We only got, no, that's 4 out of 7, excuse me. So we only got 3 more to do. 2 of those 3 appear in the wisdom literature. They are Wisdom and Sirach. Good. The last 2 of the 7 books in the wisdom literature are only found in Catholic Bibles, not in Protestant. That means that there's got to be 1 book among the major and minor prophets, which is Baruch. Right. Baruch is a book not found in Protestant Bibles. Because Protestants follow the practice that the Jews decided upon in 100 AD, when they decided that they would restrict their sacred books to 39 books, and they left out those 7. Jews prior to that, at least in the Septuagint, the Greek translation, had 46 books, and the Christians followed that practice of having 46 books. This is a good segue, thank you very much for asking that, into the next thing that I want to do tonight, which is do a quick review of all those dates I threw at you last time. Because I know it tends to get muddled when you get so many dates. And so I think it might be helpful if we just review those real quick. We'll do something. Do the last 2 rows on this. There, thank you.
When did the Protestants
Protestantism began, this is the traditional date, in 1517. So that would be 450 years ago, approximately. Is that right? I'm not good with math. That's why I went into theology. Something like that, right? So very shortly after they started, Martin Luther translated the Bible and chose to use 39. And was 46. How? That's exactly what we're going to go over in this first handout. Let me just make sure everybody's wound up with one. Did everybody get one? Terrific. Okay, well, just to review real quickly, the overcall 1000 BC down to the time of Jesus. The most recent book in the Old Testament is probably Wisdom, which is 50 BC or so. So they all came into existence in Hebrew, but they were not collected together until probably about 450. The Pentateuch had solidified into a 5-book collection. And probably around that time, the Deuteronomistic history was added to it as scripture. In the 300s, the prophetic books get settled upon pretty well. But even then, there's no actual official declaration as to what's in the Old Testament and what's out. Well, I mentioned to you last class that the king of Egypt, Hahn, wanted to do something nice for his Jewish constituency, so he caused the Old Testament to be translated into Greek. And that translation, known as the Septuagint, it was done in Alexandria around 200 BC, wound up having 46 books in it. And that, at the time it was done, that was the most official statement as to what's in the Old Testament and what's not. 200 years later, Jesus appears, dies and resurrects, and you get the early Christians, people like Matthew, Paul, etc. We noted last time that their Bible was ordinarily the Septuagint. They normally quote from the Septuagint in the New Testament writings. Consequently, they were using the Septuagint. Consequently, we assume they accepted a 46-book canon. This irritated the Jews, especially that they were using Greek and not Hebrew version of the Old Testament books. So the Jews around 100 AD at a council called Council of Jamnia, that's the city where they met, all of the rabbis got together and decided once and for all what's in and what's out. When all the dust settled, they had decided upon only 39 books. We said last time, the principal reason that they rejected the 7 that were included in the Septuagint, and which the Christians had recognized, was because they could not find Hebrew copies of them. This did not change the opinion of the Christians. From 100 AD on, you have the Christians using 46 books, and you have the Jews using 39 books. Now you get up to about 400 AD, and most people now speak Latin rather than Greek, so the Pope commissions St. Jerome to translate the Bible, Old Testament from Hebrew, New Testament from Greek, into Latin. This is known as the Vulgate. Jerome initially intended only to include 39 books in the Old Testament because he got his copies from the Jews, saw that they only used 39 books, figured they should know what the canon of the Old Testament is. After all, they wrote the Old Testament. So he intended only to use 39 books, but the Pope overruled him and said, no, we Christians have always used 46 books. We'll continue to use 46 books. So Jerome translated the other 7, and they got included as well. So the Christian canon remained 46 books for 1,000 years and more, all throughout the Middle Ages. The Christian canon has 46 books. I mentioned to you in the Eastern Roman Empire, where the Christians are eventually going to break away and become the Orthodox, they wound up with two additional books. We're not quite sure how that happened, but it is the case. But at any rate, no Christians had 39-book canon prior to the Protestant Reformation. The typical date for the Protestant Reformation, I'm not sure this is on that page, is 1517. That's when Luther wrote the list of objections that he had to Catholicism and nailed them to the door of the church in Wittenberg. Immediately, he wanted to produce a version of the Bible in German for his followers who did not know Latin and needed a German copy. So his translation of the Bible in German comes out 5 years later in 1522. And lo and behold, it only has 39 books in the Old Testament. Why did Luther only include 39? Well, same reasoning that Jerome had done 1,000 years earlier. He got his manuscripts from Jewish rabbis. He saw that the Jewish rabbis by the rabbis to restrict the canon to 39 books. We mentioned also that at the same time, in 1522, he also took 4 books out of the Old Testament and put them at the end. So his Bible consisted of a 39-book Old Testament, a 7-book Apocrypha, he called it. Apocrypha means private. It's okay to use for private reading, but it's not to be used in public worship. That's the idea. Then a 23-book New Testament and a 4-book appendage to the New Testament, which were those 4 books that he said were of less than full canonical status. They were not fully inspired as the other books. Within a couple of generations, those 4 got moved back in to the New Testament, so all Christians have the same 27 books in the New Testament. But Protestants have not yet moved the 7 books of the Old Testament back in. Whether that will ever happen or not, we don't know. It has been customary for Protestant translations more and more frequently to include the Apocrypha as a section between the Old and New Testaments. So I don't know if that indicates a trend, but there it is. Okay, did I leave anything else?
Who makes these decisions over the years in the Protestant? Groups of people?
I
Go ahead now.
Well, I suppose each church has its own way of doing it. I know there's a World Federation of Lutheran Churches, which I think is headquartered in Switzerland or something. Geneva, isn't it? I believe it's in Geneva. But I don't think they have authority to say to each of the Lutheran bodies that you have to do this or not. But virtually all Protestant groups have always held, once they reinserted those 4 New Testament books, I don't think any Protestant group has ever questioned whether we ought to include that 39 or this 27. You'll occasionally come across an article written by a Protestant wondering whether we ought to include the Apocrypha back into the Old Testament or not. But that's just individual voices. No Protestant group has acted on it. If some Protestant group were ever to do it, then I suppose it would have to be done according to whatever governmental structures they have within their church. And that varies from church to church. The second half of that page, by the way, is a freebie. It doesn't have anything to do with our course, because we're talking about the Old Testament. But hey, I thought you might be interested. There's a little description of how the New Testament books wound up being collected and forming ultimately a canon. I don't want to go over that now. You can look at it yourselves at home later on if you'd like. But it is kind of interesting to see how the New Testament got formed as well. Either way, you wind up with a canon. And a canon, as the footnote says, is a list or a set of authoritative religious books. Christians, of course, have a canon. We know it's either 39 plus 27, 46 plus 27, or 48 plus 27. Jews have a canon. How many books are there in the Jewish canon? 39. Minus 7 and minus the New Testament, right? So those 39 they do not call the Old Testament. They call that the Bible. And it stops there. What about other religions? Does Islam have a canon? Yeah, exactly. The Quran is the inspired books par excellence. According to Muslims, the Bible, Old and New Testaments, are also originally revealed by God and inspired by God, but Muslims maintain that they got corrupted over the centuries of transmission about 5 or 10 minutes, but I would like to pause here because I'm ready to move on to the next major topic for the evening. So let's take our break now, shall we? We get light. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made a firmament, and separated the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. God called the firmament heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Other translations, for example, the two Catholic translations I mentioned last time, New American Bible and New Jerusalem Bible, I believe use the word dome to translate the word firmament here. Apparently, the ancient Hebrews conceived of the sky as being a dome. So basically, in their thinking, the universe was a plate and a bowl. You have the plate, which is the landscape we're standing on, and you have the bowl inverted over it, forming the sky. The reason why we have waters above and below the firmament is to explain why there are seas and lakes and rivers down here. These are the waters under the firmament. But there must also be waters above the firmament, the dome. Otherwise, we couldn't have rain. If you read the description of the flood story, which appears later on in chapters 6, 7, and 8 of Genesis, there's actually reference made to windows up in the dome. And when these windows were opened, the waters above would come sluicing down, and when the rain stopped, the windows got closed. This is just fairly typical thinking back then. So, what do we get the second day? Sky. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. Why did they say one place instead of several places, Pacific and Atlantic? They only knew the Mediterranean Sea. That's what they're thinking of. Most Jews back then probably would have thought of the earth as being flat, not round, and as being circular, like a dime, with the sea at the center of the earth, Mediterra, middle of the earth, and then with a ring of land around it, which is Israel, Rome, Egypt, etc. So, let there be a let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind upon the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a third day. The basic botanical classification back then seems to have been into plants which have their seeds outside fruit, which would be like grasses or wheat, and seeds which have their plants which have their seeds inside fruits, like apples and so on. At any rate, what we get on day 3 is a couple of things. We get earth and sea separated, but we also get plants. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. And he made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. Day 4, sun, moon, stars. And God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the firmament of the heavens. So God created the great sea monsters, and every living creature that moves with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. So, day 5 we have both the fact that we were dealing with different sources here. Discrepancies like that, for example. Discrepancies like formal majestic style versus simple and colorful. Well, actually, that second one brings me to a second type of evidence which scholars use in order to analyze out sources in the Bible. That is stylistic variation. Here we see stylistic variation. In one account, in one source, the style is formal and majestic. In the other account, the style is simple and colorful. Indication of two sources. It's possible for one author to change his style, of course. So if that were the only evidence we had for sources, I'd be leery of saying two sources. But all of these evidences concatenate together and reinforce each other. The third and last type of evidence that scholars ordinarily use to discern sources is doublets. A doublet is telling the same event twice. Or more broadly, saying the same thing twice. Hey, the entire narrative we read tonight is a doublet, right? Creation is told twice. You get to count 1, you get to count 2. If we were to look at some other passage in the Bible, let's say we took the flood story, and we wanted to notice the sources that are used there, we would discover that at one point, God tells Noah and his family to go into the ark, and they do. They go up the ramp and enter it. A paragraph later, God tells Noah and his family to go up the ramp, and they do, and they go into the ark. That's a doublet. You know, unless God hit rewind in between, and they all came back and they went back in, which I don't think happened. Interestingly enough, you find the very same stylistic differences in the flood narrative that you do in the creation account. One paragraph will be formal and majestic, and the next paragraph will be simple and colorful. And then the next paragraph will be formal and majestic, and the next paragraph will be simple and colorful. Not only that, but the paragraphs in the flood story that are formal and majestic, they also always use Elohim. And the paragraphs in the flood story that are simple and colorful, they always use Yahweh. Plus, the paragraphs that are simple and colorful and use Yahweh depict God anthropomorphically. My favorite is after everybody gets in the ark, we're told that God reached down and shut the door. Isn't that beautiful? I love that. It depicts God as being so caring of these people. And the paragraphs that depict God as formal, or that use a formal majestic style and call God Elohim, depict him as transcendent. He talks from the sky down to the man on the ground. here's a good question. Do you suppose that the people, we don't know who they were, who ultimately put the Bible together and decided to put chapter 1 up against chapter 2, didn't notice that there were contradictions there? My guess is they would have noticed. Well, certainly, whoever first put them there got it from two sources and knew that he had two sources. Why would they have put these two accounts back to back and just leave them that way without editing them to smooth over all the little problems? Oh, now there's a good theory. Yeah. Two different audiences, perhaps. And whoever put the two chapters together there decided to leave one for sophisticated audiences and one for unsophisticated audiences. Wouldn't you agree that chapter 1 is considerably more sophisticated than chapter 2 is? Right. Right. Right.
Why did they put the chapters as they did?
Oh, that's a completely different story. Whoever first put these two chapters together did not know that he was putting together chapter 1 through 2:4a up against chapter 2:4b and following. He simply put the narratives together and let them flow. In ancient Hebrew manuscripts, there are no chapters. In fact, there aren't even paragraph markings. In fact, there aren't even periods to tell you where the sentences are. In fact, they don't even have spaces between the words. No vowels and no spaces. How about that? Really, if you look at an ancient manuscript of Isaiah, it's just one letter after another from beginning all the way to the end. So chapter divisions were added at around 1240 AD in the Middle Ages, probably by Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And verses were added even later, probably about 1550 AD, getting close to the time of Shakespeare. Prior to then, we didn't have verses in our Bibles. That's a fairly recent innovation, 500 years ago. So you can ask, why did the guy in the Renaissance, a fellow named Robert Estienne, a publisher in France, why did he, split the verses the way he did? And there's a theory which says that he marked where the verses divide while he was riding his donkey from Belgium to Paris. And because the donkey was so bumpy, that's why he made such lousy divisions in where the verses go. But I'm sure that's a made-up story. I don't think it's by tense, you mean past, present, future?
No, I mean, you said flow, Lord God, and...
Oh, no, in fact. The flood narrative that I was just describing appears in Genesis chapters 6, 7, and 8. And there you find variation between Elohim and Yahweh, variation between formal and majestic and simple and colorful, variation between transcendent and anthropomorphic. So it looks as if we have two sources that continue on. Scholars have names for these sources. The source that is found here in the second creation account, they call J. And the source that's found here, they call P. The reason why they call the second one P is because, not so much in this creation account, but in other passages where you find this style and Elohim and transcendence and so on, you find interests in priestcraft, how to be a good priest. So most scholars think that this author was probably a priest, that he seemed to have a special interest in priesthood. So we use P to represent the priestly author. J Ja. With a J. So that's why we use the J. We got that from the German scholars who initially discerned these sources. So to get back to your question, it is not simply the J source from here on. You find sometimes the J source, sometimes the P source. In fact, throughout the entire Pentateuch, scholars have discovered 4 sources. One of those, of course, is the J source. Another, of course, is the P source. But we have been able to discern using discrepancies, stylistic variations, doublets, and so on. We have been able to discern 2 other sources. One we call E, one we call D. This one we call E from Elohistic. This is a source which uses Elohim, but does not have the priestly interests that P has. Remember, P used Elohim also. But P has those special priestly interests, E doesn't. This one we call D from the word Deuteronomic, because this source is only found in the last of the 5 books of the Pentateuch, Book of Deuteronomy. So there were 4 sources which over time became combined to form our present Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible. And these sources do not all come from the same time. The J source was probably written somewhere around 900 BC. The E source probably comes from around 800 BC. The D source probably dates from around 650 BC. And the P source probably dates from about 400 BC. So, as different sources were written, they became combined into the full narrative that we have now. The Pentateuch grew over time like a pearl in a clam. Not a clam. Oyster. Oh, could I just say one more thing? You had asked earlier, why would they just slap those 2 chapters up against each other? If the second chapter came into existence in 900, that's the J source, right? Then 500 years later, when somebody wrote that more sophisticated account, the J source would already have been sacrosanct. You don't mess with the J source, it's been around for 500 years. So he probably set his up against it because he treated the J source with a lot of respect and didn't want to alter what was already there. But anyway, you were going to answer that. Oh, well, now there's an interesting question. I'm awfully sorry that we're out of time. Now, that's a really good question, seriously. You raised the whole question of the historicity of the narrative. How much are we supposed to believe in all of these narratives in the Old Testament as having historically happened, exactly the way that they're written? And I was being facetious when I said too bad we're out of time, but in actual fact, I am intending to begin our discussion next class with this very issue and also with a related issue, which has to do with the inspiration of the Scriptures. We've seen how they seem rather haphazardly to have come into combination over time. We've seen that they involve contradictions. Why is it then that we affirm of the Scriptures that they are inspired by God? And in what way do we affirm that? And how do we reconcile our belief, which I firmly believe, that the Scriptures are inspired by God? How do we reconcile that with the sort of things that we're seeing here? And I am going to wait till next time. Sorry. Well, I do appreciate you all coming this evening, and I love a cliffhanger, don't you? Come next time.